Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very exciting webinar on vicarious traumatization and clinical supervision. The actual title is Transforming Vicarious Trauma, a Supervisor's Role. And we're so fortunate today to have Dr. Rick Williamson. He's a leading expert on this. He's a clinical psychologist with the Amada Institute of Behavioral Health and Wellness. It's a community mental health organization. His work to date has focused on traumatized and vulnerable populations, both locally and abroad. For the past 10 years, he has engaged in international work in some of the most challenging and trauma-impacted places. Some of the locations include Egypt, Lebanon, Kenya, South Africa, Thailand, the Philippines, and Haiti. In these contexts, he worked directly with Dr. Lori Perlman, the originator of the concept, the vicarious traumatization. His goal is therapist psychological health, as it's an essential component for all of those who provide care to vulnerable and traumatized populations in difficult environments. He's a member and past chair of the California Psychological Association's Education and Training Division, Division 2, and he has directed and coordinated clinical training and treatment programming in various mental health agencies, including Kennedy Institute, Fuller Psychological and Family Services, and Augustus F. Hawkins Family Mental Health Center in Watts. He's worked as a therapist with LA County Department of Mental Health for many years. So all of this combines to enhance his passion for promoting the health of therapists internationally and locally.
Okay,
welcome, Dr. Williamson.
Welcome, everybody. Glad to be here with you. Topic is going to be covering vicarious traumatization, and particularly your role as supervisors. The goal is obviously for you to understand what that is, the process that it represents, but not just understand it, how do you actually recognize it and what do you do about it? And so the overview of the workshop is going to be on recognizing vicarious trauma specifically, but here's my caveat with it. When we say vicarious traumatization, we actually mean quite a bit of sort of stress impairments. And so that's sort of the broad definition. There's a specific definition of vicarious traumatization. And so I want you to understand both because it is actually pretty helpful to know that when you're seeing vicarious traumatization in your clinicians, when you may actually recognize it in yourself, there are some particular things that you can do that help to mitigate it. Versus when you see things like burnout, compassion fatigue, some of the other things that are stress impacts. But when we say vicarious traumatization, we actually mean all of those things as well. It's true, the good things that we can do are going to help all those things, but there's some specific things. If you're dealing with burnout, there's some specific things that you may want to think about. If you're dealing with compassion fatigue, there's specific things with that. And so I want you to get a good sense of those. What are the specific things that you do for each? Because we don't have unlimited time, attention, and energy. So we want to be as strategic as possible and proficient as possible with what we're dealing with. So that's the VT piece and how it actually affects clinical supervision. It does affect the quality of clinical supervision. However, clinical supervision also mitigates the VT process. When I say VT, I do mean vicarious traumatization. So it's good to understand why clinical supervision has such a big role in the VT process. If it's good supervision, it really mitigates it and transforms that experience to the positive. If it's supervision that is lacking, it really, unfortunately, can perpetuate it even. And then, so what do you do about it? What do you actually do as supervisors to actually mitigate that process and help your clinicians to grow and thrive and better serve the people who they're actually serving? I think I would have failed, though, if I come away from this and you haven't actually sort of applied this to yourself. So if I do my job well, not only do you come away with, here's some really helpful applied tools for your supervisees that you can actually implement, but it's also, here's some things that you can actually do for yourself as well. And I really would like you to see yourself in the process. So if I give myself the A if you come away with both of those. All right. So where I'd like to start then is just with a bit of an analogy. So if you can think back as to, when you first decided or when you first embarked upon the role as a supervisor, or, management up the chain in any sort of way in an organization, your reasons for doing so. Now, typically when I ask this question, and I ask for, what's your motivation to actually do supervision, to actually be the person that other therapists actually come to? What I'm hoping is that you're still in touch with some of the positives, the things that were truly the motivating factors, and it's helpful to stay anchored and not forget those things, because, during the course of the work, you can forget those things. There can be some stressors, some demands that come along with this role that you have as a supervisor that really do cause us to forget, why did I do this again? Because there's some real challenges with it, and so when I ask this question of folks, typically people give me, 2 or 3 or 4 positives. Here's what motivates me and here's why I do this. And then when I say, okay, well, now what are the stressors? What are the negatives? They give me about 20 of those, and so we can really be swallowed up by the real challenges that come along with this. But, part of it is I'm glad that we actually can see the challenges and then we can respond to those things. But I think the trick and the real challenge that we have is we don't always see the stressors. We don't always see the stressors. And you may think, of course, I do see the stressors. There's some stressors that come along with this work that you may not actually see. And it's really important to be able to recognize and grapple with all of those things, because it's the ones that you don't see that are the ones that typically set us up for the problem. So I want to give you this analogy of the fish, because it does sum up sort of everything that I'm going to tell you. And it sums up the research on stress impact, BT, and how that actually affects people. So story goes like this. Group of young fish, which is what you see in the picture, set out for the first time in the ocean, and they're excited about their experiences, what they're going to accomplish. They're excited for it. So the group of young fish actually represents people who are launching off into the supervision field. They're supervisors for the first time, brand new at it. And there's excitement. They're excited about, what they get to accomplish, maybe seeing growth, maybe seeing change, maybe affecting more clients through the supervisees that they have. But they also know that there's some dangers out there in the ocean. They know that there's some predators that they need to avoid. They know that there's trauma. They know that there's some real stuff that they have to be mindful of. Well, they swim along, and at the end of each day, they gather around to debrief. And at each debrief, they just talk about the highlights. They talk about any sort of dangers that have come along. And they do this on a daily basis as they grow and develop and get better at what they do. Well, about a few days into this process, they pass a much larger fish who's been out there for a while, and that's the big fish you see in the picture there. The larger fish sounds like, or the larger fish actually in passing just greets the group of fish and says, "Hey, how's the water?" And that's the greeting, "How's the water?" And nothing more is said, and they just swim past each other off into the distance and disappear, and nothing more comes of it. At the end of the day, the group of young fish gather around each other to do their debrief. And during the middle of the debrief, one of the younger fish says, "Hey, remember that old fish? He asks, how's the water?" But what the heck is water? Now, none of the other fish knew. So they all sort of looked at each other blankly. Nobody knew what water was. So that's a perfect setup for what we're going to talk about. And the point of that little analogy is, when we look at stress, when we look at trauma dynamics, when we look at the things that actually cause us to be worse clinicians, less effective with our clients, experience burnout, quit, leave. There are some things that we know are stressors, but then there's some things that we don't even realize are the stressors that are actually burning away our cushion and our reserve, so that when the big stressors come along, we don't even have any reserve to deal with it. And so it's almost like there are little stressors that are around us all the time, and we habituate to it and we don't see it. And that's why I'm talking about the fish in the water who don't see the water. The fish don't see the water because it's around them all the time. They eat, they sleep, they breathe in it. It's just there. So they habituate to it, and it's very difficult for them to see. that is actually how a large part of the stress dynamic and the trauma dynamic actually works and affects us. There's the trigger stresses, there's the trigger dynamics, the things that are big that catch our attention because they feel so negative and we see those things. But what we don't often grapple with is, okay, but the everyday stressors that don't necessarily ruin your day, but it's a part of just doing the work. It just comes along with the territory. It's a part of just working in your particular agency. It's there all the time. Those are the things that actually whittle away your cushion and your reserve so that when the big stressors come along, you don't have what you need to deal with it. So they work together. Big stressors that you can see and the little stressors that don't necessarily ruin your day, but you don't attend to it either. Those are the things that work together. So if we're going to actually move in the direction of resilience and thriving and coping and all of the positives, yes, we have to know what to do with the big stressors, which are obvious. But we also have to develop a real ability to see the everyday stressors that don't necessarily make our radar. And then we have to know what to do with those as well. So it's sort of a two-pronged approach that's needed in order to move our supervisees in the right direction and also move ourselves in the right direction so that we're growing over time as opposed to actually developing stress impact. So if that's sort of a helpful analogy, I'm going to refer back to this as I go through the content as we move forward. So to give you a sense for, some of the stressors that you may not necessarily recognize as the stressors or the strains, they may fly under the radar a bit. Supervisors, you typically are thinking, oh, I'm a supervisor, so I'm sitting in clinical supervision, talking about cases with particular therapists. And that's true. There is clinical supervision, and that fits our mold. But I know that many of you, if not all of you, also wear 2 or 3 hats. There's crisis supervision that you're also doing. And what I mean by that is, there are times where, let's say, a supervisee or a clinician, their supervisor is away or they cannot reach them. And so they contact you because there's a crisis going on that needs to be resolved and they just need a supervisor. So you get pulled into situations where you may not necessarily be the person who has a long-term relationship with that particular therapist. And you may not even know the clients, to be real honest. But you got to step in and intervene to mitigate some crisis that's going on because maybe the supervisor is away. And so you're the backup, which means you're responding, you're dealing with things, but once it's mitigated, or once that main supervisor comes back into the picture, you step away and you really don't get a chance to see, okay, how has it resolved? You don't get a chance to sort of enjoy the fruit of having put your energy and effort to something. And so that's a part of what you're actually navigating, particularly in a time like COVID-19, where it just sort of amplifies all of the stresses. Some of you, if not all of you, are also responsible for your trainees in terms of their role as employees. So you have administrative supervision that you provide. And so we're talking now about productivity standards. We're talking about, are they there on time? Do they check in? Do they check out? Those sorts of things. And with administrative supervision, we bring a stick and a carrot a lot of times. It's the type of supervision where, to be real honest, you know what that's like yourself. You've been there. If you could just get out of the meeting without getting more work dumped on you, that's your goal. So you may not necessarily say everything. You're just trying to escape so that you don't get more put on your plate in those meetings. That's a very different quality of interacting with a supervisor. Whereas clinical supervision is one, when it's done well, there's sort of an alliance there where the person can actually be open and talk about their learning edges and sort of put things out on the table in terms of, hey, I think I can use some help here. And maybe even speak to their vulnerabilities or their weaknesses in their learning edges. Whereas administrative supervision, it's almost like the opposite. You're just trying to present everything as well, as everything's okay, because it's a different dynamic there. But, when administrative is done well, it also works. But when you have to then juggle all these hats in the same person, that's not necessarily intuitive. And it's something that you actually have to learn along the way. Because it may not be something that you've ever been taught or trained in. And so this is one of those things that count as a stressor, something that is a demand that's on your plate. You don't really have a template for how to do it. You've got to figure out how to do it. You learn along the way, most of us, and it does actually take energy and effort from us. And if that's where the energy and effort is going, then when the big stressors come along, there's less energy and effort available to mobilize to deal with those things. So this is an example of some of the dynamics that are going on for our supervisors. Ultimately, it's this, though. You know, why would anybody supervise when there's so much that is demanded of you? Um, Supervision is a great opportunity to affect clients' health therapeutically. It's a great opportunity to see clinicians grow so that they can affect clients in positive ways. Ultimately, the role of a supervisor is always to protect the public. It really is that client on the other end of the supervision process that is always the focus. But I like this particular description of the supervisor's role that I've pulled here because it really highlights, hey, the reason why the supervisor's role is so important in the process of protecting that client in the public is because you can have unhealthy clinicians. Clinicians can start off very well intentioned, but they deal with issues like transference, compassion fatigue, burnout, vicarious traumatization, all the things that we're going to talk about without recognition of the symptoms until they're very progressed. And so this is part of the challenge. People do not recognize when the stressors, when the trauma dynamics are actually starting to show up initially. And so it starts to affect the work. They don't see it, but who does? Well, the supervisor's in a pretty unique role to be able to actually see these dynamics, see how the clinician is actually changing and being affected. And so the supervisor should notice these symptoms before the clinician a lot of times, because the clinician themselves, it's hard to see yourself. But the goal is for the clinician to be able to notice these symptoms for themselves as well. I would say the same thing for the supervisor. For the supervisor, you should be able to notice when you yourself are being impacted by stressors, transference, compassion fatigue, burnout. You should be able to have a lens for recognizing when you yourself are actually getting out there in the red zone along these things, and then be able to take action to get you back into the ideal space. So that's the whole point of the workshop on how we actually do that. What you're seeing now is what's called a stress curve. And the stress curve is basically a way of conveying, here's how human beings respond to demand, stressors. What you're seeing on that x-axis is, consider it this way. The further to the right that you go, the more demand, the more responsibilities that are on your plate. So what this is really trying to convey first and foremost is there is a limit to what you can deal with, to what you can manage. There's a limit. Nobody has limitless time, attention, energy, and effort to deal with everything. So that X right at the top of the screen there that says you're right at that fatigue point, if you go beyond that X on that X-axis, further to the right, you just don't have the energy or the attention to deal with more on your plate, more responsibilities. So in order to deal with those things that get put on your plate beyond your natural capacity, you have to shift your time, attention, and energy to deal with those things. Shift it away from other things that you're dealing quite well with to the new things. And when you start to do that, that's where the errors can creep in, because you can't manage a million things. You know, there's a limit to that. So as you manage a million things, there's probably 500,000 that are not being managed as well. You know, the errors start at that point. And you actually, if you live in that space, and that's just sort of the way that you have to operate regularly, your energy is not being replenished. You know, it takes much more to manage beyond your capacity than you can possibly recharge when you step away from the role. And so over time, you will see people start to experience drain, and eventually they start to burn out. And so you're seeing 4 zones, 1, 2, 3, and 4 there. And it's really representing, you know, the level of drain or stress. Now, zone 4 is really easy to explain. That's when a clinician, or even you as a supervisor, truly feels stressed out, truly feel burned out. You're ready to quit. You know that there's a problem because you can feel that stress. I've got too much going on and I can't do it all, or I'm experiencing anxiety and panic and all of the negatives. Really, really easy to know when somebody is there because they feel it. Zone 3, however, that's where people are beyond their capacity, but they may not actually recognize it. This is the problem. This is the whole point of my analogy with the fish. You can get beyond your capacity, but because the stress has not manifested in you, you don't realize that you're beyond your capacity. You actually think you're solving and dealing with everything just fine, and that's what the dotted line represents across the top as intended performance. We think that we are managing all this stuff just fine. But in reality, We're not. We're actually making some errors. And the people who actually see those errors before we do are the people who work closely with us, or the people who do life with us and live with us, because there are certain symptoms that do emerge unbeknownst to the person who's experiencing it, but it's really recognizable to the people around them. And so that's the piece where we want to develop a lens for understanding, okay, what do we need to actually be able to pick up on in a clinician that would signify that they're in that zone? Because if we can catch it, or if they can catch themselves in that zone, there's a lot that they can do in order to get back into the ideal zone, which is zone 2. You may think it's zone 1, but it's actually zone 2. Zone 2 is when people are working, but they've got some cushion. They feel like they're working at about 80, 85% capacity, so that if anything else gets put on the plate, if something pops up, some big stressor or demand, they actually have some cushion to deal with it. They feel like they can actually deal with more on their plate than is currently on their plate. Doesn't mean that they want more on their plate, but they actually can deal with more. That is ideal. Zone 1 is not ideal. That's when you have too little on your plate and you feel bored, disengaged, which is a different type of stress. And that's not good either. So zone 1 and zone 4 are negatives. Zone 2 is ideal. That's where we find the most thriving, vibrant clinicians and supervisors. They manage to live in zone 2. Every now and then you'll encounter situations that will bump you into zone 3, maybe even zone 4 if it's an acute crisis that hits you. Because there's nobody who's impervious to horrific things, right? And when that happens, we do have to take care of ourselves to get back into zone 2. But the problem and the real challenge is too many of us live in zone 3 and we don't realize it. And we're actually not optimal. We're actually not functioning and thriving. We're actually burning out slowly. And so if you put yourself in any of these zones, when you think about yourself, let's just say the past 2 months since COVID-19 has caused all of the shut-in for most people, where would you put yourself? Which zone would you put yourself in? If you just take a look at, how are you doing? How are you managing all your responsibilities? How are you feeling about everything? Which zone do you fall? This is a really good exercise to do every now and then. A lot of us will put ourselves in zone 3 or in zone 4, but let me explain what that actually feels like to the individual. Zone 4, you're stressed out, you're beyond your capacity, and you're feeling that. And what it feels like is, wow, if just some things were taken off my plate, life would feel a lot better. I need things taken off of my plate. I need less responsibility, less to deal with. That's zone 4. People who feel that and place themselves there are very accurate because they feel that stuff. Zone 3 feels like, I'm handling all of my responsibilities. I don't need anything more on my plate though. So heaven forbid somebody tries to put more on my plate or something else comes along. I just don't feel like I have the bandwidth to give. And they're right in zone 3 on one part of it. They don't have the bandwidth to give. Where they're probably wrong though is I'm handling everything just fine. That's what that dotted line represents. You think you're handling everything just fine, but you don't see that there's errors creeping and you're not really handling things quite as well. That's what zone 3 feels like. I'm handling things, but I don't need more on my plate. Zone 2, the optimal zone, feels like, yeah, I'm handling everything just fine. I actually have cushion and can take on more if need be. That's what zone 2 feels like. Zone 1 feels like, I don't have enough to do. I'm bored. I'm disengaged. I wish I had more to do. Now, I'll be honest, if anybody is in zone 1, you're not probably going to get the answer to how you deal with that from this talk, because in a COVID-19 crisis, I don't think that many of us know what zone 1 is. We don't even remember what zone 1 feels like. So I'm going to assume most of us are either zone 2, 3, or 4. Our goal, how do we get everybody, our therapists, into zone 2? Where they are living and working and operating in such a way where they have cushion to deal with the things that will come up, because that is what life is guaranteed to do. It's going to throw you curveballs. Therefore, the cushion is definitely something that is required and mandatory. And if life doesn't throw it to you directly, it's going to throw it to you indirectly through the clientele or through your supervisees. And you're going to be able to need to manage those things. That's why the cushion is there. Okay, so the goal is zone 2. How do we get there? The challenge is, most of us are in zone 3. Many of us are in zone 4. And let me just say this: if you put yourself in zone 2, if you put yourself in zone 2 or even zone 3, there's a lot of inaccuracy in self-assessment. Okay, and so what you probably need to do is go ahead and ask the people who you do life with, hey, I think I'm handling all of my business just fine. What do you think? And if they don't agree with you right away, if they pause, if they hesitate, if they hem and haw, that's probably an indication that you're not in that ideal zone. It's probably an indication that you're probably in zone 3, meaning the people around you see that, hey, we got to walk on eggshells around the person because their tolerance has shrunk, they're irritable, they're not sort of handling things, they're maybe making a few errors that they don't catch, but we catch, so we got to fix it. That's probably what's going on. So ask the people who you work with very closely, the people who you do life with, and if they pause or hesitate to respond, to tell you, hey, and agree that you're doing everything just fine, that's a real good piece of information to let you know that maybe not everything is as fine as you think. That's zone 3 stuff right there. Okay. Just a check. I'm looking at the chat room here. If folks are hearing, so we just did the mute, which may have just even muted me, but I'm back on. So great. Thanks, Carol. All right. So we're going to zone 2. That's where we're headed. How do we get there? How do we get our clinicians there? Part of the challenge here, though, is we're dealing with trauma dynamics, and it's easy when well, I shouldn't say easy. That's not the best way to say it. It's recognizable. It's really easy to identify when the trauma itself is direct, when the bad stuff happens to you or results in a real trauma impact. What we're talking about with vicarious traumatization, though, is indirect trauma. The trauma is happening to someone else with whom we have a relationship with. It can be a client, it can be even a family member or friend. But in the role of a therapist, it's the client typically. And that opens us up to a particular type of process that does have an impact on us. It does change us over time. And it's just difficult to see because it's so gradual. This is the water in which the fish are swimming. And we have to really develop a way to understand that. But we definitely see its effects. And here's one example. Clinical competence across time. The study came out a few years ago where they're looking at clinicians' impact on their clients. And they're looking at, do the clients get better with a particular clinician over time? That's the goal of therapy. What they're finding, though, is that for like 60% of therapists, their clients are actually not getting better in the same way, meaning the therapist is having poor client outcomes over time. When a therapist has been doing this job in the therapy role, working with clients over a longer period of time, they're having worse client outcomes than the therapists who are coming in new. That is really surprising because you would think that the longer you've been doing the job, the better you are. What we actually find is the longer you've been doing the job, the better you are at holding the client, maintaining the client. The client stays with you longer. But does the client actually improve? That's where the people who are newer are actually doing better. And when we think about it, there's an intuitive way to understand this. We can see newer clinicians coming in who have been trained in the latest evidence-based approaches to deal with particular issues in the clientele. They're applying those things. The folks who've been at this for 11 to 15 years, and if you haven't kept up with updating with the latest evidence-based, you're operating on very old models. And so if you're not updating, which if you're busy, if your clientele is high, if you just don't have the bandwidth to update, because that requires energy and bandwidth to go to trainings and then apply the trainings to change what you're doing to fit that requires work. If the bandwidth doesn't permit you to do that, you're going to just do the same work in the same way over and over again. And that's when you'll find over time, newer clinicians actually outperforming the people who've actually got the experience. So what are those factors that go into this? Well, yes, the length of time you've been practicing because they're not updating on the latest understandings and therapies, but also higher number of cases. And so higher number of cases, particularly if they've got, trauma dynamics, because that actually erodes the bandwidth that you need in order to update your training. You don't have the space or capacity to do that. And when you think about the types of environments then that are going to be sort of the prime candidates for this sort of a dynamic to play out in a therapist, agencies that give people high number of cases. And in those cases, there's a high number of people who are dealing with trauma dynamics, and there's this sort of performance orientation because we've got productivity standards that really become sort of the driver in these agencies. Because, you have to keep the funds coming in. That is important, but they're going to sacrifice things like learning, things like, how do we actually make sure that our clinicians are up to speed and applying the learning that's coming out. That gets sacrificed. And so we can see those conditions, and a lot of us work in those environments, and so this is our reality. How do we move in the right direction when this is the actual default reality for a lot of the environments that we're working in? This is just our, a bird's eye view of, hey, many, many therapists at some point in their career, they're going to experience burnout. They're going to experience compassion fatigue. They're going to see the manifestations of these stressors that actually show up. What this slide is really suggesting, though, is, when you start to look at, 75% though of therapists experiencing these stress impacts over time, you really have to look at the clientele that they're working with as well, because when you're working with people who have been dealing with trauma, there's a real factor with this one. We find that when you're working with vulnerable populations, the more vulnerable the population is, the more likely that you're dealing with trauma dynamics. And remember, we're talking about now VT, indirect trauma, which you may not necessarily realize is doing something to you or to the therapist. It's indirect, but it's absolutely resulting in, over time, what we're seeing. And so the more vulnerable the clientele, children, women, undocumented, what have you, impoverished, lower SES, the more likely that we're actually dealing with trauma dynamics. And so that is also a piece that I think we have to grapple with. So let's just jump right into it then. So, when we're talking about, these things that result in therapists, not being able to help their clients as effectively over time, we say vicarious trauma, but we actually mean a lot of things by that. So I'm just going to break it down to be inclusive about what we actually mean when we say VT, vicarious trauma, to not leave anything out, but to also give you, here's some things to think about as you deal with it in your own life, but also in your own therapist. Compassion fatigue in the research shows up, and that's really when you get to a point in the work with clients and you no longer have empathy for them. You're the very people who you're there to help, you no longer feel that connection and that empathy. So that's a real dynamic that shows up for a lot of therapists at some point in their experience doing the work, which is unique and different and worthy of sort of looking at in and of itself on its own. That's a particular dynamic that we can speak to, and I'll speak to that momentarily. Burnout is, we all know what that is, but there's a specific sort of way of understanding burnout that's really important, because burnout is when you truly get to the place where you're exhausted, you don't have anything to give, and you're actually doing worse work with the client at that point. And so burnout is when people quit the job, or they quit the job, but they still show up to the job. You know what I mean when I say that, right? That's not helpful. And so we want to be able to understand what burnout looks like, because that needs to be approached a little bit differently than compassion fatigue if we want to be real strategic in how we engage it. And then there's vicarious trauma, what we're here to talk about, and this is different because vicarious trauma is actually not an end result sort of stress manifestation. Pure vicarious trauma is just a process that happens because you're doing work with people who have been traumatized. It's a process. It's almost like the current in the ocean that the fish are swimming in. You've got to deal with the current, because if not, the current's going to take you with it. And that's what vicarious trauma is. It represents this ongoing current that is there because trauma dynamics are operating in the relationships. And if you don't sort of recognize it and put some energy into counteracting that, it's going to take you to a bad place. And then you're going to see real manifestations of problems. So let me start with compassion fatigue. This is really, Charles Figley is the researcher behind this, but what he's really trying to capture, and so forgive me, what I'm going to do in this explanation, I'm going to tell you, here's the hallmark of what makes this different from the others. And therefore, if you see why it's unique, here's what we do to deal with it. Because if you look it up in the research, all these things overlap. They sound very similar. None of these researchers sat down together and said, here's how I could make mine different from yours. They all just said, hey, I see a problem that's happening with therapists, and I'm going to try to capture it and explain it. And so I'm going to distill what makes each unique, because that's the basis of why I would approach it the way that I do. So compassion fatigue, the hallmark, what makes it unique, it's really speaking to that lack of connection, that lack of empathy and compassion towards clients. The very people who the therapist is there to help, they no longer feel empathy and connection to. And why this is there, there's this dynamic that exists between the client's needs, which are tremendous, and the therapist's resources, which are limited. The client needs, which are tremendous, and the therapist's resources, which are limited. So there's a gap. There's never enough resources to truly meet all of the needs. And if you just think about it this way, California as a state has resources that it devotes to mental health. But in terms of the actual mental health need, as rich as California is, there's just not enough resources to meet all of those needs. So look at that on a microcosm. You have therapists who have their own resources and skills that they bring to the clients that they serve. But I guarantee you that the needs there are greater than the resources that any one therapist can provide. The problem is therapists start to forget that gap, and they try to fill that gap by working harder, working longer. And this happens because there are clients that they dislike. There are certain clients that they have an affinity for, and they might work a little harder, a little extra, a little longer, and that's fine. But when you start to do that for too many clients and you reach a tipping point where you're giving out much more than you can possibly replenish, that first sign of that is that lack of empathy. That's what goes away. And so if you can catch that at that point and then remedy and sort of do a rebalancing, that's really what's needed. And so when it comes to when it comes to compassion fatigue, I would be asking therapists pretty direct questions along the lines of, why they might be aligning with their clients in the way that they are, why they might be working in unsustainable ways. Is it because you're operating out of some sort of a messiah complex? Is it that you have countertransference going and you've got your own issues and you're really trying to work that out with your clients, and that's what keeps you working so hard? You're trying to resolve your own stuff with them. These are very psychodynamic questions, which the clinical supervision space is excellent for. You're not moving into the role of the therapist, but you are talking about what is going on in the work between therapist and client that causes the therapist then to lose empathy, become less effective because that empathy is no longer there. And if you can have a therapist who can really speak to that, you can really do some good work around that. What we're shooting for, the opposite of compassion fatigue, is compassion satisfaction, and that is being able to actually get pleasure from doing this work. You have the skills to help people. You want to help people. It's this sort of lean in orientation. Hey, I want to help. That's what we actually want. That's the sign that somebody's in zone 2, compassion satisfaction, sort of a willingness to help and wanting to actually help. So often we deal with zone 3, where it's like, you can see it in clinics. You can see it in agencies. You walk into an agency and the first person you come to behind the triage or the intake desk, they never look up and make eye contact with the person. It's like, wait a minute, these are people who need mental health, help, support. And one of the first things they encounter is lack of eye contact, which, can convey lack of humanity, which can convey disrespect, all these things. And when the staff at all levels, whether it's the security guard at the front door, whether it's the person behind the glass or whatever desk taking the intakes, or whether it's the therapists themselves, everybody has to be aware that they've come to work in an environment where people need their mental health needs met. So that means we've got to be willing to then deal with the realities of what it means to have mental health issues. So be attentive, don't do things like, laugh and joke with each other when you know that the clientele that you serve have paranoia, because they're going to misperceive that laughing and joking with each other as you're laughing at them. These are the things that, hey, if everybody just sort of wakes up feeling like, hey, I want to do my job today, and actually does it, it makes the therapeutic environment so much more therapeutic, and it makes the experience of the client so much more therapeutic, and we see outcomes with that. So we're shooting for compassion fatigue, the opposite we're shooting for compassion satisfaction, the opposite of compassion fatigue. Okay, let me do a quick pause because I want to just look My mic may be rubbing against my shirt. Okay, thank you. Good point. Um, Hopefully, no more background noise. Okay, are there any questions to this point about anything that I've covered? Let me just do a quick pause. I'm not able to see too far up in the question chain. Carol, do I have any questions that I need to clarify?
No, no,
No.
there are no questions at this point. Thank you, Rick.
Okay, great. Okay, just keep them coming if you got any. I'll just continue.
I'll turn my picture.
Okay. All right, so burnout then. I'm going to make a distinction, though, between burnout and compassion fatigue. Burnout is really when you're exhausted. When your therapist is exhausted, when you are exhausted, and that exhaustion is not just related to you being at the job. That exhaustion follows you. It's there in the morning when you wake up before you go to the job or open the laptop, whatever you're doing these days. It's there when the work hours are over. You think you should feel sort of energy and excitement because, hey, the day is done. But no, you're exhausted because you got to come back and do this thing tomorrow. It just never lets up. It's that exhaustion that follows you in all domains. That's burnout. But along with that, there's what we call depersonalizations, which are really another way of saying people start to become cynical and jaded. Their outlook on the clients is that the clients cause their own demise. You know, you definitely know and recognize this in other therapists. When they get jaded and burned out and they just have this real cynical outlook, it affects their ability to actually be an effective therapist. They can no longer hold hope or bring hope to a client. The worst thing is that they have a client show up and the client sits down with a therapist who's burned out, jaded, and cynical, because that client's going to leave worse. Clients need hope. That's what therapists bring. And along with the skills, the therapists have hope. There's some things that we can do to move things forward, to make things better. If the therapist does not have that, then the client is going to be left with whatever the therapist has, which is cynicism. And a lot of times that cynicism is actually looking at the client and really actually accusing the client for not being able to help or move forward. Cynicism is really, really caustic. And so this is why, and I'm going to give you my opinion on this, I think we see productivity challenges in particular therapists. Particular therapists always fail to meet productivity standards, 65%, 70%, whatever they are. Not because they fail to schedule clients, not because they fail to book their day full of clients, but because they're burned out and it becomes so negative for a client to sit down with them. An empowered client is not going to show up. They're going to avoid that therapist. So they're going to have this crazy no-show rate. The unempowered client is actually going to show up and be made worse from the experience. I would actually rather have the empowered client not show up than to have the unempowered client show up and be made worse. And so maybe have a lens for looking at burnout and seeing this as you look at particular clinicians who have a consistent no-show rate. Why might that be? And then the solution then is to not put on your administrative hat and bring the stick and say, well, then double book your clients. The solution is put on the hat of the clinical supervisor and say, how can we get you to a place where you can re-experience hope, lose that jaded, cynical outlook, get out of burnout so that it becomes a different experience to actually interact with you. You can bring hope, and then you will see people want to actually come up and show up to their appointments. It's a much longer process, right? But that's the solution here. So understanding burnout is pretty key. Yes, Carol.
Yeah, there's one question, whether there are individual differences. This is from Jamie. Whether there are individual differences in therapists or supervisors that you can address. Aren't some of us better at working and maintaining a zone 2? Others have greater difficulty doing this to the point that maybe they should consider a career change.
Great question. So very, very simple answer, which I will unpack as we go through this. Yes, there are differences in capacities, sort of the capacities that you bring naturally to sort of dealing with demand, stress. Some people have a greater capacity than others. However, I'm not so focused on what your innate capacity is, because no matter what your innate capacity is, when you step into the role of dealing with trauma dynamics in the population. I don't care what your innate capacity is, you need more capacity. So it's how do you cultivate the capacity that you already have, that you have innately, so that you can actually do this work well. To be a supervisor, you know, a lot of times, and this is, you know, I'm gonna give you my opinion, but it's based in like, you know, I get this directly from Carol Fallender. Okay, so I'm gonna just say it that way. Who's done the work in this. We select supervisors based on, well, were they a good therapist? And the supervisor is a very different skill set. That is a different skill set altogether. Being a good therapist means you might have some capacity to sort of blend that over into supervision. But, you know, being a good supervisor, that's a whole skill set of its own, you know, and the capacities that you need to actually be a good supervisor and do that well, so that you're actually getting good client outcomes, but also moving clinicians along a process of growth and development so that they're doing good work. You know, that is something that we have to realize is cultivated. It is cultivated. So it's how we invest in learning those skills, in turning those skills into sort of habits. You know, what are the values that are motivating us? That's the stuff that we want to pay attention to. So yes, ultimately there are folks who have less capacity, but I would say before you think that they should off-ramp and get off the bus and find a different career, there are ways where we can develop those capacities so that they can do this job well. Now, there are always the hiring errors, people who rolled in onto the bus and they just missed the bus. They're at the wrong bus stop, right? You know, and so that's the HR error, okay? And for those folks, I'm like, do you really want to try to cultivate capacity in somebody who just is not suited for this? There are ways to sort of navigate that, which I would say a consultant role is probably a little bit better for with the HR department, you know, especially if they are hiring people like that repeatedly, because that is problematic. So yes, some people do need to get off the bus, but for the most part, we can work with people who have some capacity. Yeah. Okay. The last piece with burnout, let me just say this. Burnout does also typically in the research talk about there's something outside of the control of the therapist that they have to contend with in a burnout dynamic. What I mean by that is this. Maybe the caseloads are very high because the plan to bring the services to that area are resourced by some sort of an algorithm that's just not appropriate for your particular clinic or your particular area. And therefore, you don't have the resources, you don't have the number of therapists, you know, so the caseloads are very high, and that's the source of burnout. So the therapist has to deal with twice as many people on their caseload as sort of the average therapist does. And there's no way to sort of remedy that because that's the way the structure has been set. And I say that because I personally lived through that one for 11 years, working in the county of Los Angeles, where in Watts, Compton, where I worked for you know, those 11 years, we had a plan for the whole county, which says, hey, we're going to resource each service area based on the population that's there. And so they give us so many therapists, they give us so many dollars to do mental health work, but they don't keep in mind, but each area has its own culture in reality. And so when they didn't think about that, what they did is they gave all the resources to downtown LA because we've got Skid Row, we've got a lot of homeless, we've got LA County Jail, which is the biggest provider of mental health services probably in the world. And so when people get out of jail, they need to plug into services right there. So that's where they put the bulk of the resources. But they did not keep in mind, well, but we're locking up Black people at a much higher rate. And so when you let Black people out of LA County Jail, and they have paranoia because they have mental health issues, and they set foot on the streets of, you know, downtown LA, which has Skid Row and homelessness, that's not an environment that you want to stay in, let alone somebody with paranoia. And so they're going to gravitate towards safety. Safety is, well, what's familiar? Well, it's the environment that they come out of, their home environment, which is Watts and Compton. So you get all this overflow coming out of downtown into Watts and Compton, my service area. But we're not equipped for that many people because the plan is those people are supposed to get their services in downtown, but you can't talk them into that because they're driven by mental health issues. They're driven by paranoia. They're seeking safety. Therefore, we just have high caseloads. 200 and 300 is our caseload, you know, and that's ridiculous. And that's the burnout. So we just have to figure out, how do we deal with these high caseloads? Because either we treat them or they languish on the street because they're not going back to downtown. And so that's what I mean. There's something outside of our control as the therapist, or even as the program heads of these agencies, which are really controlled by the strategy of the county supervisors and the people who make policy. But they might fail to sort of keep in mind some of the particulars of our particular agency or our particular domain. And then the therapist has to make up for that somehow. So that's burnout. That's a burnout factory. And so my 2 cents, we can experience burnout. That does not mean a failure of character. It does not mean that you're weak. It means that you got those dynamics that you're dealing with. And when you got those dynamics where you're trying to make up for some system that is not suitable for your particular clientele, and you are the one who's standing between that system and resources and that clientele, you know, that's the dynamic. So recognize it as such. And then what do we do with it? You know, part of it then is, if there are things outside of our control which are driving the dynamic, it's very important for clinicians not to lose touch with the fact that they're actually in control of a lot of other things. It's the lack of the sense of agency that is part of what makes the burnout, you know, progress. So if you can remind clients, and remind therapists that, you know what, even though you're dealing with crazy caseloads and things that are outside of your control that really are, you know, demanding a lot from you, figure out those things in the course of your day that are within your control, and you focus there. You set your big caseload according to your schedule. So you put your more difficult clients that are more demanding earlier in the day, where you got some bandwidth to deal with that because your brain works that way. You don't put those difficult clients at the end of the day, where you're just, you know, looking forward to whatever that's going to bring at the end of your day when you don't have the energy. When the phone rings and it's, you know, the program head or the people up the chain, and you know that it's going to be, you know, more work or stress that you have to respond to, don't pick that phone up on the first ring. Pick it up on the third ring, you know, and those little things are just reminders that you have agency in this process. And when you have that reminder being reinforced in that way, and people are actually engaging their own agency, it does reduce the negative feel of navigating those situations. It doesn't take away the stressor. It just reduces the impact of the stressor. Because if the situation can convince a therapist that they don't have agency, that they're just in this sort of knee-jerk response to things outside of their control, that's what's going to hasten the burnout process. And so this is just my advice, you know, in terms of how you might want to think about this in working with those situations. Ultimately, I say get a consultant in there who can speak to the people up the chain and maybe, you know, move things in a direction where resources get appropriated in a better way. Okay. Yes, Carol.
Okay, new question. These are trying times. They're testing our level of comfort levels, providing services outside our level of comfort, like telehealth. How would you address the supervisees or clinicians who are questioning their skill set due to outcomes with engaging client families through telehealth services? It's very different from their schooling and their practicum training. They're feeling more drained, more mentally engaged. Families, client concerns will lead to burnout and compassion fatigue.
Absolutely. Real reality stuff there. Absolutely. And, you know, let's keep it in the bigger frame too, because, you know, it's one thing because I don't want to miss a piece here. Yes, we have to deal with the obvious stressors of we are now having to do things very differently. And maybe we're all on our learning edge with this. We have to deal with that obvious stressor. We're mobilizing to deal with this transition. Let's not miss the fact that some of us came into this time with no bandwidth whatsoever. And now we're seeing what we're seeing, not because the stressor is so great, but because the way that we were doing life and work to come into this did not actually leave us any bandwidth or cushion to deal with this in an effective way. So we've got to deal with both, right? And so, but what we've got on our plate is the immediate. And so, yes, these are things where I would say, and I'll unpack this a bit later, but just quickly, there's a frame and a narrative that supervisors do have to reinforce for our therapists and our clinicians, which is you are going to be at your learning edge so that when you encounter these things that are just beyond what you feel that you can do well, you're less likely, I hope that you become less likely to interpret it as failure. Because if it gets interpreted as failure, and then that elicits reaction based on failure, everybody has their own internal standards. You know, anybody who goes through grad school has a lot of drive, and their standards are very high for themselves. And when they don't meet those standards, stuff kicks in to make them work harder, you know, and so failure is sort of a default that we have. But if we can sort of grapple with it differently, it's their learning edge. It's an opportunity for growth to acquire new skills. We're moving towards a global community, is what I would, how I think about it. And part of moving towards a global community is we then have to understand, in order to truly be equipped to deal with tomorrow, and tomorrow, whatever that looks like, means we're not going to be doing the same things today as we are tomorrow, because we're moving in a very different environment. There's a real inflection point in time where I hope we don't go back to what the old normal was in a lot of ways. I know some of us want to, but to be real honest, now you're going to get me on my soapbox a little bit. Hey, having people working in an economy where they're just barely making it, and so when a pandemic comes, they are deemed essential workers and they're exposed to this virus even more so because they're stuck in these jobs that, you know, they have to show up to, and they need this paycheck because they live so meagerly. You know, we call them heroes, but hostages is a pretty accurate description there. Do we want to go back to that? You know, we're not trying to get back to that. We're trying to move forward, you know, and so this is a real inflection point in time where, yes, it is going to be difficult because we're building this chariot as we ride it. There's some new stuff that we want to implement, which means everybody's on their learning edge. How do we interpret that constructively as opposed to a sense of failure? And that's one of the challenges. So we'll get to this in the end in terms of how we really unpack that, but that's where we're going with it. Okay. Vicarious traumatization. So VT, I'm going to say VT to save, you know, having to say 4 and 5 syllables every time I want to refer to this. VT. This is different from compassion fatigue, which is what you experience in the therapeutic interaction. This is different from burnout, which is what you experience in life because you don't have anything left to give and you become cynical. This is a process that is always ongoing when you're working with people who've been traumatized. It's a negative transformation that happens in the therapist over time because the therapist is engaged with the client, they're hearing trauma material from them, they're seeing the impact of trauma, and they have this role to help. They have the therapist role, which puts them in that responsible mode. And so a lot of therapists have this process of empathy when they're hearing horrible things that happen to the kids that they serve or that individual who, you know, has sort of survived horrible things. When that trauma comes up in that client, the therapist is going to do something in their head that goes something like this. Wow, that really is painful. That's horrible. And what they're going to do is they're going to put themselves in the shoes of that client, or they're going to put their family members in the shoes of that family, just to appreciate, wow, if this happened to me, that would be horrible. That's just an empathic move that we make a lot of times when we ourselves haven't gone through whatever that experience is. And so it's understandable, it's what happens, but when we do that regularly, when we do that as a course of how we do our work over time, trauma case after trauma case, our brain registers some things. It says, hey, when you put yourself in the shoes of that client, that feels negative. And if you just feed your brain that negative impact day after day, year after year, because you see trauma clients, your brain is either going to figure out how to process that effectively, or it's going to figure out how to develop defenses so that it can cut that stuff off because it feels negative. If it develops defenses, the therapist is not probably going to realize that they are short-circuiting their own therapeutic process with the client. They're not going to realize it. That's why you get worse client outcomes over time with people who are doing this work. It goes something like this. Client comes in, they sit down, they start to talk about things, and all of a sudden the trauma stuff comes up, the emotions are there, and the therapist's defenses kick in because they've heard this stuff day after day, year after year, and it is negative. It does feel painful. So the defense kicks in, and the therapist says something like, you know what, everything's going to be okay. Or the therapist says something like, you know what? You've told me that, God is really important to you. Let's remember that God is in control of all these things. Now, those things might be helpful and true. But if it's coming from a defense, what it's going to do is it's going to then register for the client as, hey, pull it together. Everything's going to be okay. What's needed for a traumatized client, though, is not to pull it together in the therapeutic space. What's needed for the traumatized client is, I need to put words and expression on these emotions that I've not put words and expression on before, and do this in the safe space because I can't really integrate it. That's the therapeutic process that's needed, which has just been interrupted because the therapist has said something that causes the client to pull in their emotions again, to compartmentalize that thing, and they can't then do the work of integrating it into a narrative. That's how subtle this stuff is. The therapist thinks that they've actually done a good job because the person stops crying. But what's actually happened is the therapeutic process has been interrupted, and that person's going to leave just like they came in. They're going to leave the same way. And so that's how subtle this stuff is. That's vicarious traumatization showing up in a countertransference reaction that causes the therapist to say something that interrupts the therapeutic process, and the therapist does not recognize it. That's how we get worse client outcomes, because they start to do that often. And so this is what VT manifests as. And so I'll give you an example of VT because I want you to be able to see it in yourself as well, if it's there, because you can't avoid this. You can't avoid the impact that trauma dynamics have. Now, you can work with it well so that it doesn't cause you to have defenses and be worse down the road, okay? But you can't avoid this process because it's just a part of working with people who've been traumatized. You will hear this stuff. So I worked with a lady who worked with women, a bit of a trigger warning. She worked with women who were sexually assaulted and then mutilated by their assaulters. I work internationally. So this was in the African context. This was in Central Africa. This was an African lady who said, hey, I'm going to be a therapist to the women of the tribe that I'm a part of, because what we're dealing with is these marauding groups of African soldiers come in as a part of their terror campaign. They kidnap the women from my village. They rape them, and then they intentionally mutilate them, but leave them alive and send them back to our village so that we can see this horror. And that's their terror campaign. And so she has been working with these women as the therapist. Now, this lady, when I first met her, I came to do a class that she was a part of. And the class is, how do you help people deal with horrific situations if they themselves become the targets of it? If you get kidnapped, if you have to go through torture, interrogation. So I work in really bad contexts where this can happen to people. So I've got to help people cope with that. And so as a part of dealing with, let me just say it this way, this content, this lady sat in my class and just gave me the most horrific stare through the entire class. And I'm not talking a class that lasts an hour. I teach this class for 2 weeks. It's a 2-week class because you got to do some pretty gruesome things in this class. So for the first 4 days of just classroom work, she's mad dogging me. She's looking like she wants to just take me out back and just whoop me. And I'm not understanding why I'm catching this live from this lady. Towards the actual end of the class, where we actually put them in situations where they're being interrogated, and they're being really put in really bad situations, because I'm the therapist who's doing the training, but I've got 7 other colleagues of mine, and they're all special forces military guys. And their job then is to put people in stress and interrogate them in really horrific ways. And I'm trying to make sure that people don't get traumatized, but I'm trying to make sure that you get the lessons that I've taught and you apply it in high stress situations. Because if you can do it here, then you can do it there. It's state dependent learning. It's structured that way. Anyway, this lady, towards the end of all of this high stress stuff, she does eventually come to me and she says, hey, Rick, can I talk to you? And I say, sure, what's going on? Now, she still looks like she wants to do damage to me. She's not looking pleasant. And I'm like, okay, what is she going to say? And what is she going to do if I pull this lady aside and it's just me and her talking? She tells me, though, hey, I'm a therapist like you. Surprised me. I'm like, okay, you're a therapist, but you're giving off a real strange vibe. And she says, you know, the women who I've been worked with, here's the situation. And she explained the whole thing to me, the rapes, the mutilations. But she says, here's the issue why I'm talking to you, Rick. My husband has been away studying in the UK for 2 years. He's finished his studies, he's coming home. How can I be intimate with him when I've heard all these stories of sexual violence for the past 2 years? That's why she was telling me this. She didn't know how to engage in physical intimacy because she's been hearing all of these stories of sexual violence for the past few years from her clients. Then I understood why she has the reaction to me, because she explained the perpetrators are African soldiers in the jungle regions who are kidnapping these women and perpetrating these crimes. I am African American. I am in Africa doing this course. I am dressed in paramilitary uniform like those African soldiers, and my colleagues are all military guys. I'm the very image of these abusers. And so I can see now that this lady who herself was never abused, but because she has heard these stories day in, day out, she has become sensitized to half of the population, men, particularly Black men, even worse, Black men in military uniform. That is what I represented. That's why I'm catching the mad dog vibe from her. That is what vicarious trauma does. Okay? It causes you to then become guarded in such a way where it shapes your interactions, it shapes how you do life, and it's not just with the client. It's there because you hear over time all of this stuff from the people who've been traumatized, and then you start to do life differently. You start to do relationship differently, both within and outside of the therapy setting. That's VT. And so if you think about your own sense of how you do this work, you know, has VT also affected you? Because you have to think, I've heard horrible things that happen to children. When you think about then how you protect your own children or your nieces and nephews, do you let them do sleepovers? Do you avoid certain things and their world is smaller because of what you've experienced in life, because of what you've seen and witnessed over time? You know, this is what I'm talking about. There's so many of us who, because of the work that we do, we avoid certain things or we avoid certain people. You know, there are many of us who this is humorous, but it's true. You cannot help the work role kicking in. So when it says, who am I? The work role, the therapist hat kicking in. If you witness a parent losing their cool with their child, you start to think, is there abuse? Do I need to file a report? Now this can be on a Sunday and you're in Walmart, where many parents are who have had it up to here with their kids, okay, Walmart. And when you start to avoid places that have parents and kids because you know that this is your process, that is VT. So you miss out on the great deals that happen in Walmart and Kmart. Those are some good deals. You miss those, and you instead say, no, I patronize locally, my local dealer, my local store. Great, okay, but if it's driven by VT, it's still VT. Okay, you just find a different way to understand it. But understand what's going on with you, because that's the same thing that's going on with your therapist. Over time, you start to do life differently because of the stuff that you hear, witness, and experience, and that is what we're trying to get at. That's a process that happens. Okay, let me pause. Any questions about how I've explained it? I hope that it's understandable, because I want you to reflect on how this is.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question. I think it's more general too, so I'll just make it generally. And that is, increasingly, workplaces are requiring people to return to work. And this includes supervisees and supervisors and everyone. And the question remains, you know, it's kind of embedded in large building, and one could telework, but in fact, the agency or setting wants everyone or some people back on site. So it feels kind of like being a hostage rather than a hero.
Yeah.
And wondering about fearfulness about one's own safety and whether it's really necessary, and what kinds of thoughts you have about all that.
Yeah, absolutely. So great. And this is something that we are going to have to, we're all going to have to work through over the next, you know, weeks and months. So yes, there is, and here's my hesitation with it. Here's what as supervisors, I would really Also keep in mind, your employees that are employees are dealing with this, but your trainees as trainees are probably hit worse. Okay, so maybe have a couple of categories for this. Your employees, they might actually respond to, the call to go back into the office by saying, I just don't feel safe. I'm going to use some time off and I'm going to take it. They've got time off accrued. They can do all sorts of maneuvers, which I would still say that's them utilizing their agency, which that's not a bad thing. We just want to be constructive with it. Your trainees who've been there, less than a year, because that's what the tenure is for a trainee, or 9 months, they don't have accrued time off. They're not even employees in that way. They just have to be there. They can't take that time off in the same way. And there's a huge cost if they do. They don't get their hours. They have less agency in a situation where they may actually experience and feel threat to their health and safety, or to the people who they love who may be, dealing with things that they don't want to expose them to the virus. And these are, more than anything, I would say, as a supervisor, number one, these are really important conversations to be able to elicit where your staff truly are, what they're truly sort of grappling with. And even though these are realities that we're going to have to figure out how to move forward with, understanding it, reflecting back, that you just sort of using sort of your best skills as a supervisor to be able to hear this, put it on the table, and then sort of be able to grapple with it as an agency is key. I would say this also, and this is my opinion now, and this is me putting my consulting hat on. There really isn't one sort of one size fits all solution on this one. There are some people who do have to figure out how they not go back to work. My advice as a consultant, don't have that be something that is subjectively navigated. Figure out how you put protocols in place to determine when people do have to have the agency support to delay that process. Where we miss it is we don't put the protocols in place, and then we start to make these decisions based on subjective stuff, and then biases come out, and one person gets to not come in, but another person has to come in, and there's no rhyme or rationale other than you like this person, or maybe you understand and know about this person and you don't this person. That's what we want to avoid, making a bad situation worse. And so if we can get out of subjectivity mode when it comes to how we're making these decisions, and put in place those protocols which take into account the real reality of our staff and the real reality of the clients who we're serving, and then figure out how we do it at least in a way that is, not bringing in biases and eroding morale. We're trying to get through a time. We're trying to buy time and get through it as best as we can. That's where I would say we start. And then each agency obviously figures out how they sort of have to tailor and do things, particularly to their staff and to the resources that they have, human resources included. It's a complex problem. Trust me, we did not get here just because COVID-19 hit. We got here because everything leading up to COVID-19 is now being exploited by COVID-19. And we're not going to get out of this with any sort of a quick fix. We've got to look at systems and protocol. We've got to look at a big picture. But the strategy number one is, let's not make it worse than it has to be. Let's try to curb the negative impact, give ourselves some time to figure out how we then deal with it more constructively without making it worse in the meanwhile. So that's what I would recommend. Not a panacea, but I think, reality. Okay. All right. I'm going to go into another piece here, because if you can recall where we started, part of the challenge is with indirect traumas impact, like vicarious trauma, we don't recognize that it's actually working on us and causing these changes. We don't recognize it when it's happening. It's very slow, very subtle. It's the water in which the fish swim, and we're the fish, and this is the water. And so how do we then sort of recognize when maybe those first signs and symptoms are coming up? Well, in order to do that, we can just look at sort of a template of how our body responds to chronic stressors that don't necessarily ruin our day, but it does show up in our body, and we can be attuned to things like the viscera, the breath. You know, if we can be really attuned to ourselves, we can start to see these things and catch it early. This is how we develop a lens for seeing the therapist in zone 3 before the big stressors have sort of shown up and the therapist recognizes it for themselves. And we got to do this for ourselves as well. So how we deal with stress when it's chronic. We're wired to deal with intense stress, which is not chronic. So we're wired to deal with how do we survive animal attacks and how do we survive the worst. That's how we're wired, our body. But our reality is, but we deal with not saber-toothed tigers and bears. We deal with, you know, traffic. We deal with trying to juggle work and kids. We deal with, you know, constant noise and impact from this environment around us and demands. And so if that's our everyday stuff, you know, what's uniquely different about that is, okay, it's not life or death in the moment, but it never lets up. It's something that we encounter all the time. Whereas the animal attacks, we just have to survive that. And then, you know, we're good. It doesn't happen all the time. So we're wired for a certain environment, but our environment today is very different. But the wiring is the old wiring. So that system is still being activated, but it's being activated every day instead of every now and then. And so that is what chronic stress is doing. It's activating an old system that is designed to put us in fight-flight mode to allow us to survive a moment of attack or threat. And it's putting us into fight-flight mode every day. And there's a cost to that. So understanding the brain, there's 3 parts of the brain that I would say is just really helpful to know in terms of what mediates this, because if we can strengthen the parts of the brain that are associated with us navigating these seasons well and mitigate the impact of what's going on that is assigned with, you know, the trauma and the stress, you know, we want to be able to do that well. The prefrontal cortex, your thinking part of the brain, that's what should be in control. When you're making decisions and making decisions well, that is what is driving the ship. That is associated with zone 2, the ideal zone, people operating out of that part of their brain. Zone 3 and zone 4, that's what's associated with the amygdala, that middle picture there. That's the danger center of the brain. When you experience intense emotions like fear and anger, and those emotions then become the things that are driving your reactions, that is the zone 3 and 4 stuff. And if we let that pervade, you know, we're going to actually make a bad situation worse. I always say, and I've learned this is true for therapists, but I get it from the SPACE program, actually. In the SPACE program, they say there's no situation so bad that you'll ever encounter that it can't be made worse. And I think that is so true for therapy as well. There's nothing that you're going to ever encounter that is so bad that it can't be made worse. And the culprits for making it worse are if you panic or if you become super impulsive in how you respond to it. All of it rooted in the same thing. The amygdala drives the ship. When the emotions drive, you will make any bad situation worse, which is why I'm saying, hey, we're dealing with a bad situation, we're in a crisis. Our strategy, number 1, don't make it worse. That's strategy number 1, because this is what drives the ship. It kicks in for most of us. And so we've got to figure out how to deal with that. How we deal with that is we have to keep the hippocampus strong. That's the 3rd picture there. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that shuts off the amygdala, dampens it down so that it's not activating and driving the ship unnecessarily. And so when they're in balance, what is going to happen is this. Your prefrontal cortex is making decisions. Your amygdala is picking up on the stressors in the environment. When it picks up on the stressors, it activates because it's mobilizing your body to then deal with the stressor effectively. Run away from it or fight your way through it. It's really what it's wired for. But it's just not the smart part of the brain. So when it activates, it's trying to basically tell you, I see something in this environment that's associated with any stressor with a stressor that you've experienced before. Its job is just to scan your environment for any sign that you're going to encounter something that has triggered stress in your past. That's its job. You don't know that it's doing that, but that's what it's doing. So here's the example. You've been in a car accident. Amygdala activates. It's stressful. Days later, you go to get back into the car, or you drive that part of the road or freeway where the accident happened. The amygdala picks up on the cue. I've been here before. It was during the accident. It activates. You get anxious. You know what that's like. Now, what needs to happen is You just pay closer attention so you don't get into the accident. That's the amygdala doing its job. Unfortunately, the amygdala can pick up on some really random cues in the accident that cause it to activate later, but the cues aren't helpful. Like, it says, hey, you remember that song that was playing on the radio when we got in the accident? That becomes the cue. So now you're hanging out and that song comes on and you're sitting in the house. But the amygdala activates because the song is now associated with the stress. And so now you get this fight-flight response, and you've got to figure out, whatever you're doing in the moment, how you sort of maintain while you're having a fight-flight response. Very difficult to do. So you have to have the hippocampus kick in that says, wait a minute, is this a real need for an emergency? Hippocampus is looking at your context. And if it says, no, everything's fine, it will shut off that amygdala response, and you continue what you're doing operating out of that prefrontal cortex. If it is an emergency response, it says, hey, there's some danger here. Send that information to the prefrontal cortex so you can make good decisions. And that's how you do it. But you don't need that amygdala activating so much that the prefrontal cortex shuts off, and what you're driven by is just emotional reactivity. So we've got to keep the balance there. Zone 2, things are in balance. Zone 3, things are not in balance so much, because what you start to see in zone 3 is elevated stress produces brain changes. Changes in your brain result in elevated cortisol, causing the connections, the brain cells that are connected, to lose their connections with each other in the prefrontal cortex and in the hippocampus. That is just a simple way of saying the hippocampus that's supposed to shut off the stress response becomes weaker. It can't do it. That's what you're seeing in the picture. A brain cell in the hippocampus that has a lot of connections normally, but under chronic stress, elevated cortisol, it loses those connections. It can't shut off the stress response, even though it knows that there's no need for the stress response. While the brain cell in the amygdala grows in its connections in the presence of those elevated cortisol, that stress hormone, and it's easier to set off. So you get people who are highly stressed, they can't shut it off, but they still have to stay in control and navigate an environment when their body's in fight-flight mode. That's like putting a kid who's been traumatized by an adult in their life in a classroom with a teacher. And the amygdala says, oh no, another adult who's got power over me, and it activates. And so they're in fight-flight mode because the amygdala is not accurate, it's just very general. And what we expect those kids to do is pay attention, learn, and be quiet. And their body is in fight-flight mode. And when they can't sit still and pull that off, and they start to then show the behaviors, the teacher then clamps down on that kid, which means that adult with all the power then focuses it on them, and it makes it all the worse. That is what's going on with these kids. That is what's going on with your therapist. That is what goes on with you in your respective contexts. And this is what the brain changes are doing. So let me just say, I think I'm hearing somebody's mic. Carol, can we do a mute? You know what? Let me do this. Let me get through. Let me do this. Let me give you a break, a 10-minute break. Let's come back. We will pick up on, okay, when you have these brain changes, it shows up in certain symptoms in your behavior. These are the zone 3 symptoms. You don't see it because they're very hard to see. But if you have this lens, you will then identify when you're in zone 3, when your therapists are in zone 3, and that's part of what we need to do in order to move out of